This video is sponsored by Only Crits. When Critical announced they were working on their own actual play system, a lot of people expected it to be another D&D clone with the serial numbers filed off, your classic Pathfinder situation. No offense intended towards Pathfinder, but that is obviously what it was when it first premiered. But then we discovered it was a D12 system, and specifically it uses 2 D12s for each roll, but the Game Master rolls a D20. So, why do Daggerheart's dice work that way? What does this game get out of using 2 D12s that you can't just get by rolling a D20 like you do with Dungeons & Dragons? Let's take a look under the hood and see what we can figure out in another installment of Daggerheart Demystified. If you think it's neat when I take a look at a game and make a bunch of videos about it, make sure to subscribe. I've done it a bunch of times with D&D, I've got more Daggerheart videos planned, I really want to do some Draw Steel videos in the future. I've got a little cool stuff here, so you should come hang out and subscribe and ring the bell and hang out. Let's hang out and talk about games and hang out, it's fun. So in Daggerheart, whenever a player makes a roll, the player rolls 2 D12s. So of course the first and most obvious question about this design is, why not just roll 1d20? After all, nobody at Darrington Press assumes Daggerheart is going to overthrow D&D. I'm sure they'd be the first to admit that. But they are definitely competing for the attention of the same audience. They want to be another tool that D&D players can consider using for our games. And a lot of games that are inspired by or in competition with D&D use a single D20 for all the major rolls in the game. And Critical Role has a D20 in their logo, just like most D&D YouTubers do, if we're being honest. So using 2 D12s was a pretty unexpected choice. I know Matt Mercer was asked about this at a convention when he ran into Bob Worldbuilder and Professor Dungeon Master, and Matt said it was because the D12 just doesn't get enough love in normal D20 fantasy. But the lead designer of the game, Spencer Stark, actually explained the mechanical rationalization behind using 2 D12s in a live stream on launch day back in May. Spencer explained that they chose to use 2 12-sided dice because it makes the average 13, which makes your results more reliable as a player and which makes your modifiers more significant because it's harder to roll an 18 naturally. It essentially allowed them to lower the target numbers across the board for a lot of different things you want to do in the game, which means they also don't have to deal with all these perpetually inflating modifiers that keep rising as you play the game longer, like you get in games like Pathfinder and to a certain degree in D&D 5th edition as well. You can keep the modifiers relatively low and they'll still feel like they have a bigger impact because you're not expecting most rolls to be around an average of 10 and trying to hit a DC 15 like in D&D. Instead, if the average dice result is assumed to be higher, even lower modifiers will feel like a bigger deal. So, video over, right? Spencer Stark explained exactly why they made the choice they did to use 2 D12s, so what is there left to say? Well, quite a lot actually. Because unlike D&D, when you roll your dice in Daggerheart, your final result is not just going to be a simple binary pass-fail. See, your 2 D12s have to look different from each other because one of them is the hope die, and the other is the fear die. So if you roll a 4 on the hope die and a 1 on the fear die, you would say that you've got a 5 with hope. On the other hand, if you get a 10 on the hope die and a 12 on the fear die, you got a 22 with fear. And in all these situations, you're trying to meet a target number set by the GM. So this means that every die roll has 4 possible results: success with hope, success with fear, failure with hope, and failure with fear. If you get a hope, you can often use that to unlock some of your cool abilities. If you roll with fear, you're giving the GM the tools they need to unlock some of their own cool abilities. And this is definitely partially inspired by games that use the Powered by the Apocalypse system, and I was already going to talk about that. I wanted to make this video for a long time, but then in the actual Daggerheart book, they shouted out the games that inspired these dice mechanics, and one of them is Apocalypse World, which was the originator of the Powered by the Apocalypse system, so it's kind of nice to have some confirmation that I'm not barking up the wrong tree here. In Powered by the Apocalypse games, you roll 2 D6s for every major roll. And once again, the game is not a simple pass-fail binary. If your combined roll plus your modifiers is 10 or higher, you succeed at whatever you're trying to do. If you roll with a 7 through 9, you get a partial success or a mixed success. You achieve whatever you're trying to do, but there's some sort of narrative complication that's going to make things a little bit more difficult for you going forward. And if you roll a 6 or lower, you fail, but as basically a consolation prize, you do get an experience point, so you level up faster if you roll low more often, because you're literally learning from your failures. It's a nice little bit of design. But again, I think you can see how this game system is much more deliberately designed for storytelling games rather than more tactical games like D&D. It forces the Game Master to think harder about the scenarios they put in front of their players, so that anytime the players roll their dice, they can't just keep repeating the roll over and over until they get the result they want, or even the result you want, because every roll should move the story forward in some way. Whenever the players roll a mixed success, you can't just tell them you succeed or you fail. You have to decide on some way that they succeed, at least partially, in whatever they were trying to do, or figure out how the situation they're in also gets worse or gets more complicated. That's the purpose of a mixed success. If they're trying to sneak into the bad guy's lair and they roll a mixed success, they might trip an alarm. So nobody knows exactly where they are, but the henchmen are all on alert now. And based on DC averages and the fact that you never really get these high modifiers like you do in other D20 fantasy games, mixed successes are an extremely common result in these games. They're basically the average you can expect to get if you roll 2 D6s and add a +1 or a +2. But there are a few major differences between the Powered by the Apocalypse system and Daggerheart's dice system. First of all, in Powered by the Apocalypse games, the GM never sets a DC. They never have to determine the target number for whatever task the players are trying to accomplish. The virtue of this is that the players can always just look at their dice and immediately know whether they succeeded or they failed. The downside of this approach is that everything they're trying to do in the entire game is all exactly as difficult as anything else. Everything the players are trying to do follows the exact same rules. 10 or higher, they succeed. 7 through 9, mixed success. 6 or lower, they fail. This is something Daggerheart can already address just by virtue of not using 2d6s, but instead using 2d12s, because now you have a larger spread of possible numbers you can get, but you still have a fairly similar bell curve where you're much more likely to get results in the middle range rather than equally likely to get any results like you are with a d20. And so once you break out from using 2d6s into 2d12s instead, you open up the opportunity for the GM to start setting different target numbers for different tasks the players want to achieve. However, the next major difference is that in Powered by the Apocalypse games, the GM never rolls dice of their own. If a player character is in combat, they only take damage when they fail a roll or get a mixed success. The GM is not rolling against them. In Daggerheart, the GM is rolling their own dice, although they're not using a 2d12s, they use a d20, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But I remember this being the thing I was the most worried about when they announced Daggerheart and explained how their dice system works. Because when you're playing a Powered by the Apocalypse game and you fail a roll in combat or get a mixed success, you take damage. That's part of the balance of that game. And so when they added the fact in Daggerheart that the GM rolls their own attacks on their own turns rather than just having monsters react to player rolls and do damage that way, I was really worried that this was basically going to break the system. However, earlier this year, before Daggerheart was officially released, but when we still all knew the dice system had been locked in, I was listening to an old actual play podcast that used a Fantasy Flight RPG, and I realized Daggerheart's major source of dice inspiration was never Apocalypse World. The Powered by the Apocalypse system gave them the tools they needed to figure out how to adapt the dice system from another game, Fantasy Flight's Genesys dice. And once again, the final Daggerheart rulebook that was published in May does confirm this by literally calling Fantasy Flight's Genesys dice system a major inspiration on Daggerheart. So it would have been nice if I'd gotten this video out before Daggerheart was released so I could prove that I figured it out before the rulebook came out and basically verified it, but oh well. I'm also sure some people figured it out a year before I did. That's life. You see, Fantasy Flight Games uses their own unique dice pool system for their RPGs. In their games, you roll a whole bunch of dice, and instead of numbers, each die just has different symbols on each side. Matt Colville made a great video explaining this dice system a few years ago, and he even talks in some of his other videos about how they considered doing something similar when they're developing Draw Steel. But if you're not familiar with the dice system I'm describing, here's how it works. And I'm going to simplify things just a little bit because it's kind of a complicated dice system, but you don't need to know all the different ins and outs. Just the basic gist will help you understand the point I'm making in this video. I'm also going to reference the version of the dice system you roll for their Star Wars RPG, so it's possible some of these terms or dice colors or symbols are different than in the generic Genesys system, which is basically the same system, just without the Star Wars iconography or terms, but the basic mechanics are still exactly the same when you're using the dice for whatever Genesys game you use. Your character sheet in any of these games tells you which dice you roll for certain tasks. You roll a certain number of green dice based on how many ranks you have in that skill. It's based on your ability scores. If you have proficiency in a specific skill, that determines whether you replace any of these green dice with yellow dice. You want to replace the green dice with yellow dice whenever possible. I'll explain why in a minute. Blue dice are boost dice, and they essentially represent any additional situational advantages you might have on this specific roll. Somebody is helping you, that kind of thing. And the GM tells you how difficult the situation is, and so based on this difficulty, you roll a certain number of purple dice. If the roll you're trying to make is 1 difficulty, you roll 1 purple die. If it's 3 difficulty, you roll 3 purple dice. You can also receive black dice, which are called setback dice, and these basically represent the opposite of a boost, some specific situation that is making this roll a little bit more difficult than it would be otherwise. And finally, the GM can upgrade one of your purple dice to red dice, which are the challenge dice. These are most often the case when you're fighting really nasty villains because they have their own proficiencies the same way a player character does. But the GM can also spend their resources to turn a purple die into a red die because this specific task should be very challenging because of some sort of plot reason or something like that. Players do not want to roll with red dice whenever possible. Each side of each die has different symbols on it, and the different dice basically give you better odds of getting the symbols you want. Some of these symbols mean success. The green dice have more sides that just have 1 success symbol on them than 2, and they also have 1 or 2 blank facings. The yellow dice hardly have any blanks. They have a decent number of sides that have 2 success symbols on them, and you can also roll something called a triumph, which is basically a critical success. The good dice also have different symbols on them that represent advantages, which basically just means your situation improves in some way beyond whether this roll succeeds or fails. The bad dice have the opposite symbols on them. You've got your failures, your threats, which are the opposite of advantages, and the despair, which is basically your critical failure. And so you roll all of your dice, Then you compare all the symbols you rolled, see which ones cancel each other out, and use that to determine your final result of your roll. So for example, if we use this digital dice roller I have on my phone, let's say I'm rolling 2 greens and 1 yellow, and it's difficulty 2 purple dice, and we'll throw in a blue boost die. Where is that? Did I miss it? Oh, it's this one. And we'll throw in a black setback die just to see what happens. And we roll, and we get 1 success. Oh no, I have this backwards. Oh, this is just 1 advantage. Okay, so the final result is just 1 advantage. We got 2 advantages on the yellow die, 1 failure on the black die. The purple die has a failure and a threat, and then the blue die has a success. So the success on the blue die and the failure on the purple die cancel each other out. And then the... oh, there's another success on the green. The green and the black die cancel each other out, which leaves 2 successes on... or 2 advantages on the yellow die and 1 threat on the purple die. 1 of each cancels each other out. That just leaves us with 1 advantage. Hopefully that made sense. Let's try it again and see what happens. Okay, 1 advantage and 1 success. So the starbursts are successes. We got 1 of those on each of the green dice and 1 on the yellow die along with an advantage. We got a failure on the black die. The blue die gives us 2 more advantages. So we've got 3 advantages, 3 successes. 1 of those successes is canceled out by the black die. 1 advantage is canceled out by the purple die, and then 1 more of each canceled out by the purple die, the other purple die, which still leaves us with 1 success and 1 advantage. Let's do 1 more roll, see what happens. 2 advantages. Nothing on the yellow die. That's pretty rare, but it can happen. But only a couple of threats and 1 failure on the on the purple die and the black die, which means we only got 1 success and that got canceled out, and a bunch of advantages got canceled out. So we only have 2 advantages. So this roll would basically be, oops, we definitely didn't succeed at whatever we were trying to do because we did not meet the DC of how many advantages or how many successes we needed. But we got a couple of advantages, so that's good. That's basically how the system works. However, the downside of this dice system is that it takes for fucking ever. You have to build your dice pool, which includes figuring out not only how good you are at this task and whether you have any boosts to it, but then you have to figure out the difficulty and add those dice into the pool. Then you roll, and then you have to go through the somewhat tedious process, as you saw, of figuring out which symbols cancel each other out. And it is actually fun to do. At least I thought it was fun when we played Fantasy Flight's Star Wars system, and every once in a while I think about dusting it off and diving back into another Star Wars game. I would love to run a proper Star Wars campaign at some point using the Fantasy Flight system. But it does not really work for a fast-paced game unless you're using the Dice app, which does a lot of the work for you. But if you have to use a Dice app to have fun playing a dice game, there is a problem you have to solve because something is wrong with that game. Because I can't speak to all of Fantasy Flight's games, but certainly with the Star Wars RPG, it was a combat-heavy game. Everybody was rolling these huge dice pools on their turns, including the NPCs. The GM would also have to make a dice pool every time one of the enemies acted in combat, and then they'd have to roll and calculate it themselves. However, this Fantasy Flight Genesys system has some major advantages over the Powered by the Apocalypse system. First of all, different tasks the players want to achieve can have different difficulties. This is really nice for those of us who want different challenges that you face throughout your adventuring career to actually matter, because you want the players to actually feel the triumph of tackling tasks that would have been impossible if they hadn't rolled quite as well. But I think the even bigger benefit of using this system is the fact that it offers 2 different kinds of mixed successes, rather than the one type presented in Powered by the Apocalypse games. In Apocalypse World and all of its successors, whenever the players roll a mixed success, you have to figure out exactly what that means, and sometimes it can be really difficult to figure out how to adjudicate that, because you weren't necessarily thinking about how the situation lends itself to a mixed success, especially if you're not used to running games in that system. Fantasy Flight games, I think, hold your hand just a little bit more, because now you don't have to figure out how to make something a mixed success. You're being told exactly in what way the success is mixed, because they either succeeded, but with some sort of threats, or they failed but got some sort of advantage. Even a change that minor is really helpful, because it's just a slightly more precise writing prompt for the game master to draw inspiration from. But the designers behind Daggerheart looked at this incredibly interesting and versatile system, and basically realized there are only a few results. You succeed, you fail, or get a wash, but that's basically the same thing. You succeed with advantage, you fail with advantage, you succeed but there's a threat, or you fail and there's a threat, or multiple advantages or multiple threats, but that's the same basic idea. There's also the criticals to deal with, but thanks to the very wacky nature of this dice system, you could roll a critical success and still fail your roll. Hell, you could get both a triumph and a despair on the same roll. That's a critical success and a critical failure simultaneously. Good luck making that make sense. That could be really interesting and exciting, but that's kind of challenging. But really, almost the entire system is basically summed up by just a couple of results. Success, success with complication, failure, and failure with a bonus. Technically, you could also get a success with a bonus or a failure with complication, but You could kind of eliminate those results and get a much simpler system. And in fact, Fantasy Flight have figured out the same thing, because they came up with a completely different dice pool that still did a lot of the same stuff when they developed Wrath and Glory, their game under the Warhammer 40k license. You still built a dice pool, but it was just built on normal d6s, but you rolled one extra d6 that had a different color, and this was your Wrath die. Rolling a 6 on your Wrath die was really good, so even if you failed your roll, you would still get something really good out of the roll. Rolling a 1 was bad, so you could succeed on whatever you're trying to do, but the 1 on your Wrath die meant something bad also happened. You still built this whole pool of d6s to try to hit a combat difficulty, but you're using one unique d6 to get these 4 results. Success, success with complication, failure, and failure with bonus. And again, you have success with bonus and failure with complication, but you don't necessarily need those. That's what the folks at Daggerheart realized. And they also realized you don't need the dice pool at all. You can combine this approach to rolling dice with the bell curve from Powered by the Apocalypse games, and essentially make it equally possible that every single roll will either give you a complete success, a success with a downside, a complete failure, or a failure with advantage. And so, once they refined the other mechanics of the game, those advantages and disadvantages became hope and fear, a resource you actually gain, or give to the GM, with every single roll. Now, the system is not exactly like the Star Wars dice system, because if you also remember, that system also had the boost die, which you could add to a roll if you had some sort of circumstantial bonus. And that's somewhat similar to the way you get advantage in 5th edition D&D. There's some sort of mechanic or situational circumstance that gives you an edge. And the same goes for the setback die in the Genesys system and disadvantage in D&D. Both are a way to represent some reason why this particular act is going to be more challenging than usual. And so the folks at Daggerheart essentially combined these mechanics. They took the names advantage and disadvantage from D&D, as well as the idea that advantage and disadvantage cancel each other out, although in Daggerheart that only happens with one instance of each, so if you have advantage from 2 sources and disadvantage from 1, you still roll with advantage. But the actual mechanic of advantage and disadvantage in Daggerheart looks much closer to the boost and setback dice from Fantasy Flight. When you have advantage in Daggerheart, you don't roll your dice twice like you do in D&D. Instead, you just roll a d6 and add it to your roll's result, just like in the Fantasy Flight Genesys system. And with disadvantage, you roll a d6 and subtract it from your result. Now, in the Genesys system, some of those dice facings had blank sides, and that's not the case with a normal d6. So at first glance, it seems like an advantage die in Daggerheart is a lot more useful than a boost die in Fantasy Flight. However, in Fantasy Flight systems, those other facings had successes or, well, advantages, and those results could counteract the results on the bad dice. That's not how it works in Daggerheart. All the advantage and disadvantage dice do is raise or lower your roll result. They don't change whether you rolled with hope or fear. So for example, if you roll a 6 on your hope die and a 10 on your fear die, that's a 16 with fear. But if you had advantage on the roll, and you roll a 6 on your advantage die, now you've got 22 total. That's fantastic. But it's still a 22 with fear. You can't change that. Unlike in Fantasy Flight, all the advantage die in Daggerheart can do is raise your score. But where in Fantasy Flight, a boost die might eliminate some of the threats you rolled, in Daggerheart, rolling with advantage can't change whether or not you rolled with fear. Again, it's a way to take part of the very complex mechanics of the Fantasy Flight Genesys system and simplify it to the fact that we can now still use the dice we're all familiar with as part of the tabletop RPG hobby. Even though the boost and setback dice had all these fancy symbols on them in the Genesys system, the advantage and disadvantage dice still more or less fill the same role. Still, it would have been nice if there had been some way to preserve the triumph and the despair from the Fantasy Flight system, or even just to get some sort of critical hit, the way you do in D&D. And for Daggerheart, you would think the solution is obvious. Rolling a 12 on your hope die is a critical success, and for the critical failure, you would then deploy that when the fear die rolls a 12, or instead it happens on a 1 maybe, I don't know. But I think the designers realized that if they went that route, you would have exactly the same problem with the Fantasy Flight crits. You're going to succeed on the roll, but also get a critical failure? How do you make that make sense? And if you're rolling a 12 on either of these dice, you're almost certainly going to succeed at whatever you're trying to do. Additionally, this is a system where any time you roll with fear, which is statistically half the time, you are giving your GM a resource they can use against you by replenishing that fear. So at the very least, it seems like the designers might not have wanted to handle critical failures the same way as Fantasy Flight games. And if rolling a 12 on your fear die isn't going to give you a critical failure, then it would be very strange if rolling a 12 on your hope die gave you a critical success. In fact, it would make it extremely obvious that this game was weighted in favor of the players. But you also can't get rid of critical successes entirely, because you're trying to get the people who play D&D to play your new role-playing game. A lot of them really like critical successes. And also, you know, this game is produced by the people behind Critical Role. There kind of have to be criticals in this game. So in Daggerheart, you get a critical success whenever you roll doubles. Even if you get 2 1s and you would absolutely not succeed in whatever you're trying to do otherwise, it's still a critical success. It counts as a roll with hope, and you can also clear 1 stress from your character sheet, plus criticals do extra damage in combat. This means critical successes are statistically a little bit more common in Daggerheart than they are in D&D. When you're playing Dungeons & Dragons, you have a 1 in 20 chance of rolling a critical on any given roll. The odds are a little bit better if you're rolling with advantage since you're rolling 2 dice. But in Daggerheart, your odds that 2d12s will have the same result is about 1 in 12. The difference is not massive, it's 5% in D&D versus about 8% in Daggerheart, so it's actually probably about as balanced as it could be, given this is a 2d12 system. It's as close to D&D as you could get. And I'll be honest, even as someone who really doesn't care about the dice math in these games all that much, like I'm not really someone who spends a lot of time thinking about probability, the fact these numbers are so similar is actually really cool. However, I mentioned earlier that the GM does not roll 2d12s the same way the players do. In fact, the GM rolls a d20. So let's talk about why that's the case. Like I said, I was initially wary about the GM rolling because if the game is more influenced by Powered by the Apocalypse games, the GM does not typically roll in those games, so I was worried this would upset the balance. But if we are instead modeling the Genesys system, or even the Wrath and Glory dice system, now it makes a lot more sense that the GM rolls their own attacks. It definitely makes me feel a lot more comfortable with the idea that this game is actually balanced for the GM to be able to roll against the players, whereas something like Powered by the Apocalypse really isn't designed that way at all. But why does the GM roll a d20? I think there were a few more cynical answers that probably occurred to most people when faced with that question. First of all, most Daggerheart players are probably going to be former D&D players, or at least members of the community, who know a lot about D&D and maybe even have their own dice. And the d20 is usually considered the most important die. Once again, everybody has a d20 in their logo, including Critical Role. So I think you could make the argument that Daggerheart doesn't want to tell their players that their most iconic dice they own no longer matter. Lots of people have special fancy d20s that don't even match any of their current sets. They just like to roll their own unique d20s. So if the GM still rolls a d20, then all those D&D players who have d20s they really love can keep using them while they're playing your game. And of course, Critical Role doesn't have to take the d20 out of their own logo, and any D&D YouTubers who start reviewing Daggerheart can maybe pivot to only making Daggerheart content and not have to change their logos. Like I said, that's the most cynical interpretation. I'm sure it was on the developers' minds, but if we set those aside and just analyze the decision in terms of what it actually does for the game, it actually brings up some really interesting aspects of game design. For example, because the GM doesn't roll 2d12s, GMs don't generate hope or fear, so they can't perpetuate a death spiral for the players. The game is basically balanced so that if a player rolls with fear, which is going to happen about half the time statistically speaking, you're giving the Game Master resources they're going to use to do cool stuff on their own turns. But they can design the game to work that way because the Game Master doesn't generate any of those resources themselves. By rolling a d20 instead of 2d12s, the Game Master doesn't have to wonder whether or not they're also supposed to generate hope or fear. They don't have to figure out whether they're playing the opposite way from the players. Like, when I roll with hope as the GM, do I gain a fear? Do I gain a fear when I roll with fear, but then when I roll with hope, some random player gets a hope? All these questions are bypassed entirely, so no Game Master will ever get confused or forget what they're supposed to be doing when they roll 2d12s, because they don't roll 2d12s. They roll a d20. So while the GM is the recipient of resources whenever the players have bad luck, they don't feed resources into that system themselves. They just spend resources the players generate. And already I think that's really smart design. But this also means the game is balanced in favor of the players. First of all, the GM is statistically going to roll critical hits on the players slightly less often than the players will score critical hits on the GM. Again, not a huge difference, but it is very slightly weighted in favor of the players. But the creators of the game have also said that the reason the GM rolls a d20 instead of 2d12s is because they like the more unpredictable nature of the d20 behind the GM screen, whereas they want the players to have a more consistent output. And at first, this seemed strange to me. After all, Game Masters like to have these grand plans. We talk about them planning out their campaigns in advance, setting up potential adversaries to deploy in sessions weeks or months down the road. I made a bunch of videos about that kind of thing. So when you say that you want the GM's die results to be more unpredictable, that seems to contradict what I think so often is kind of the role of the GM, which is to be the stabilizing hand that keeps the game on track as needed. But after I sat with his answer for a while, I realized that this philosophy really speaks to an interesting aspect of Daggerheart. It is actually very important for the Game Master to give up control. The D&D community has long been having a debate about whether or not a GM should ever fudge your dice rolls. I think there are valid arguments on both sides. The argument against fudging dice rolls is that if you don't care about the results of a roll, you shouldn't have rolled at all. We bring the dice into play specifically to introduce randomness and answer questions we don't know the answers to, or questions we shouldn't decide the answer to unilaterally because the Game Master could easily make a decision that punishes the players unfairly, whereas the dice can make that decision far more dispassionately. Game Masters who are in favor of even just occasionally fudging a die roll argue that it's important to have this tool in your toolkit specifically so that you can have a little bit more control over the story. There are lots of different variations of that perspective. Maybe it's because you wanted something to seem random that actually had to happen a certain way because otherwise the story couldn't play out the way you wanted. Maybe it's because you prepared an encounter that's too deadly and didn't feel like killing your players here because you made a simple math mistake. Or miraculously, maybe the game made a simple math mistake. But the reason you feel that way is because you want any player character deaths to matter, and you don't think if the players die here, the player characters die here. You don't think that a death here is going to serve the story well, because if you wanted to create a deadly encounter, you would have. This is not necessarily the encounter you would have built, but it turns out to be deadly in ways you didn't expect. Essentially, I would argue that every time a GM fudges the die rolls, it's because they want to preserve control over the story or the experience in some way. Now, obviously, you can still fudge your dice in Daggerheart. It's absolutely possible. But I do think it's really interesting that the GM, the one we most often describe in this community as the storyteller, or compared to a writer, or the person we most associate with the most creative control in the party, Daggerheart gives them the most random die results in the group. To me, this feels like the game designers of Daggerheart sending a message to the GM that they're going to have less control in this game than they're used to in most D20 fantasy games. And if the GM can internalize that message, maybe they can let go of some of the control they have over the story they wanted to tell. And that is an essential attitude to have when every die roll the players make is not a simple pass-fail binary anymore, but instead every roll is meant to move the story forward in some way. From my experience playing in Powered by the Apocalypse games over the years, it doesn't seem like you can really have a strict story that you want to tell, because anytime the players roll a mixed success, your job is to essentially figure out a new path forward for the story that involves them not getting everything they wanted. The Genesys system worked the same way. When the players roll 3 successes and 2 threats, your job is to figure out how that roll can inspire you to add 2 new threats to the game. And while you could just say, oh, I'm going to pretend I'm taking these 2 threats into account, but actually I'm just going to play the same twist I already had up my sleeve, you could do that, but that's not really how the game is intended to be run. It's intended to inspire you to change the situation based on the die roll. And the same is true for Daggerheart. It works best if you're reacting to the player's dice results by allowing them to change your story. So in a weird way, when the die you roll is the most unpredictable die in the game, it is potentially another message from the creators, reminding you that you're not in charge of the story. Of course, the nice benefits of Daggerheart using a D20 is that you can still buy all the same dice sets you normally would, and you can still use them for this completely different game system. And if you're looking for some great dice sets for your next Daggerheart game, you should check out today's sponsor, Only Crits. Hello there, I'm Winnie the Pooh, your local Only Crits spokesman. Hey, Winnie the Pooh, what's going on? The last time I saw you, there was this portal. I wasn't even sure you survived. Of course I survived. In Daggerheart, you have far more control over when your character gets killed off. You're not completely dependent on the random roll of your death saving throws, which is yet another example of the fact that you're a lot less likely to feel like your dice have betrayed you when you're playing in Daggerheart, because every dice roll moves the story forward in some fascinating ways. And so you should buy some dice you love from today's sponsor, Only Crits. But wait, you turned out to be future evil Mike in disguise, and then everything vanished and went gray. No idea what you're talking about, mate. All I know is that Only Crits has an incredible selection of dice. They got sharp-edged dice that have fantastic colors and patterns, and metal dice for when you want your rolls to have a lot of weight behind them, both narratively and literally. Winnie the Pooh, did you see where Oddwick went? He cast some sort of magic spell on me, and now I'm making a bunch of Daggerheart videos, and I haven't seen him since. The only sort of magic spell I see are these incredible discounts. Because if you visit onlycrits.com/supergeekmike and use the promo code SUPERGEEK at checkout, you'll be able to save 12% off of your order. Once again, that's onlycrits.com/supergeekmike and use the promo code SUPERGEEK. Thank you so much to Only Crits for sponsoring this video. Cheerio! Something really, really weird is going on here. I have to figure out what happened to Oddwick. But I guess you'll see me again really soon, because like I said, I'm making a bunch of different Daggerheart videos right now, and this is the second to last one in this series. I have a 4th one coming out very soon, and we're going to talk about how Daggerheart's stats work, and more specifically, why they work the way they do, and how they are essentially a response to some of the more frustrating aspects of D&D's stats. So if you want to make sure you catch that video, as well as all the other videos I've got coming out this month, there are a bunch of cool ones coming, so make sure to subscribe, and ring the bell so YouTube will notify you every time I put out a new video. If you're new to this channel, I do a bunch of other Critical Role videos, including a series where I analyze every episode of the Vox Machina campaign, and I look at the lessons we can apply to our own games. So click right here to see the video where I break down the Thordak fight, and we try to understand some of the more unconventional choices Matt made for that encounter. Until next time, play fair, and have fun.